Welcome to Columbus Report on Waycross Community Media. I'm Executive Director Dana Gagnon, and this is the program where we will keep you connected to what's happening up at the State House in Columbus. Today, we have in our studio Ohio Senator Bill Blessing. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
For being here. This is the program where we connect you to some of the things going on in Columbus to make sure you here in our area feel connected to what's going on in your state government. So we're going to see how many topics we can fit into our time today. Let's start off with daylight savings time because it makes us all tired. And it's definitely something we all relate to, but I don't think we think about how legislation and how other planning can affect that and maybe simplify it for us.
Yeah, that's right. And, there's been various resolutions over the years in Columbus as well as at the federal level. I think the United States Senate actually got something out over the past 3 or 4 years, which I think most people died of shock because it was, A, they were legislating in that area, and B, they actually had a unanimous vote and got something done. Sorry to be so insulting on that, but
Yeah.
but I mean, but even then, still, here we go marching on with this. But I think the crux of the issue with daylight saving time.
That's right, there's no S.
There's no S.
Let's point that out right now. Okay.
It's hard.
Okay.
It's hard to get that squared away. But there's two things at play. One, obviously, the time change. The big precipitous fallback and then spring forward always throws people off. Used to be for me the spring forward was the big issue, but now with kids, even fallback gets screwed up. And then there's the issue regarding who wins out on if we did all daylight saving time or we just stayed at standard time. School folks want to stay at standard time. Their argument is, look, kids are waiting at the bus stop here and it's pitch black outside. That's not good. Whereas the business community would say, look, we can maximize our revenue if there's more daylight after work for people to go to sporting events, bars, you name it. And so there's that schism. But the nice part about it is I think all parties agree that the big, leaps in time are the biggest problem, that there's agreement that those need to go away. And so I've heard all sorts of proposals, again, either stay on daylight saving time or just standard time or split the difference half hour one way. But if you look at sunrise and sunset times, it's kind of like this sine wave over time. They grow and they shrink, they grow and they shrink. What I'm proposing, and I have this resolution currently being drafted, and I'm calling it the Constant Sunrise Resolution. The idea would be that we urge Congress to adopt some sort of legislation that gets rid of those big changes in time and actually does a more continuous time change. So the idea being that 1 hour is a big jump. People see that, they feel it. But do you really feel just 2, 3, 4 minutes if you were to fall back that period of time? And the answer is probably not. So the idea would be that, every week you'd either fall back a couple minutes, you'd spring forward a couple minutes, and you wouldn't notice it because most people use their cell phones as their alarm. When they look at clocks, they're typically, like their cable box or their computer, something that is connected to the internet. And all of those are synced up to a network time server. So that network time server could be working behind the scenes to say, hey, do this time adjustment here, do this time adjustment there, which is the way it happens for a lot of people now, whether, we're falling back or springing forward. Most people wake up in the morning, they're like, my cell phone, it picked that up. And, the first time that you really notice it is when you go out to your car, which obviously hasn't changed, and you got to change it.
Which
there.
I still haven't fixed yet. Yes.
Well, there have been years that I have just been like, it's a few months. I'll wait this one out until it goes back because I use you use your cell and your computer, and so since most people use some sort of internet connected electronics for their alarms, they wouldn't notice it, and not being that big jump, they would just continue on with this and not have to deal with the fallout for that. Moreover, you would be able to pick a time that we want the sunrise to be at. So let's say the sunrise should be at 7 a.m. and that through this process, if this were enacted, it would be constant the year round. Sunrise would always be at 7 a.m. So kids going out to the bus stop would have sunlight irrespective of what time of the year it is. So I think that's good. Now, on the sunset side, that's where things, move a little more greatly because of something like this. But again, you're avoiding the jumps. You're doing the one thing that I think keeps, kids waiting for the bus stop intact. I think it's a great solution. It's innovative in this sense. And again, it's something that I hope we can at least consider in Columbus and maybe pass it out to say, look, Congress, if you really want something that's dispositive of this issue, I think this is a good approach.
And I think there's a lot of the questions that people have. I feel like this is a good time to look at something like that because, like you said, most of us look at the time on a device that's connected to the internet. And to be honest, some of the devices I have that are not connected to the internet, old analog clocks at home, battery things that I have on shelves, those are already kind of losing or gaining a little bit of time. So I still wind up having to check it against some device connected to the internet, like my phone. I wind up having to nudge it a little bit each way. So I feel like it's something that we already do as far as where do we get our time. I think one of the questions might be why? Why do we need to spend time looking at this? But there are actual expenses, besides the fact that we all know that when time changes, our pets still think they should be fed at certain times. And as you pointed out earlier, our kids still think they should be fed at certain times, even if we think it is still sleeping time. So we know that definitely messes with people's rhythms. But teachers have talked about what their students are like the week that the time changes. There's been studies, I think, on what happens with productivity in the business world the week after time happens, and it does really cost money, besides the money it takes to just program for it going back and forth and the hour difference.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And, I would say, just having this behind the scenes makes it a lot easier. And again, you mentioned the old analog clock, and I have obviously in my cars like that, but then again, it's a 2012. I would imagine some of the newer cars probably are connected in some way to, GPS or whatnot that automatically changes the time. So, for those people that do use analog clocks, you're talking about 5 minutes a week, and that is at like the points of the year where days are getting shorter or longer at their most rapid pace, which are like in between the solstices. So I would think, March and September when they're really starting to take off one way or another. So it's really not a great, deal of, hardship for people to go through something like that. And then as soon as you do realize it, you change it. But I mean, for me, some of those analog devices like the microwave, which first thing, wake up in the morning, there's the microwave, heat up some old coffee and away we go. But a lot of times if there's been a power spike or sag or something like that, or a power outage, you have to reset that anyway. And what are you gonna set that to? Typically it's your cell phone or a computer or something to that effect. I think this is a novel approach to that. And my bias obviously is towards the schools getting to work okay in the morning, because as you pointed out, when you have that time change, particularly spring forward, there are plenty of studies that show accidents go up, productivity goes down, people are just out of sync. And I think we can do away with that.
And I hadn't really thought about the accident component, but yeah, it's straight up dangerous when people aren't operating with all of their awakeness. That's probably not the best way to say that, but and this is a time of day when kids are not just waiting for buses, but walking to school, biking to school, and fighting traffic and all of that happening. So locking sunrise at 7 means the adjustments always happen on the other end.
Correct.
And we can be a little more flexible on the other end.
Yeah.
There's not so much a huge, massive kids trying to get to one place outside at the same time at the other end at the same time. So.
Right. What's interesting about it, if you ever look at a graph of sunrise and sunsets, because everybody looks at graphs of sunrises and sunsets.
I kind of love them, but yes.
You can see the effect of current daylight saving time, where they're basically doing exactly what I'm suggesting, only with a bigger chunk of time. So that 1 hour big step.
Yeah.
So with respect to the sunrise doing its thing like this, I think it's like that. It shifts the peak up. That's all it really does. This, instead of having, that big, discontinuity, it's much more flat.
So if we're looking like this is a completely unheard of thing, it's actually exactly what daylight saving time does already. It just does it once in a big chunk or twice.
Exactly.
And,
More frequent with smaller, I would argue, imperceptible time changes.
Yeah, I like that. And it's interesting to me because I know there's already, it's not something I would have thought of looking at on the state level. But I can see it would be helpful for schools, it would be helpful for businesses, it would be helpful just within our households so that our kids aren't trying to wake us up at 5 a.m. thinking it's breakfast time. Oh my goodness. But there is precedent for states saying, nope, we're doing something different. This is crazy. Yeah. And
right.
Small parts of states even. Isn't there a section of Indiana that does its own?
I think you're right about that, yes.
I'll have to look that up. Don't quote me on that. But so there is a precedent for doing it that way. And it's a neat way to be able to say, we can make a decision to do this and maybe become an example for other parts of the country and saying, hey, it worked in Ohio. Let's try this out. So,
yes, I certainly hope so. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out this does nothing with respect to time zones. That part is still very much important.
Yeah, we can't change those at the state level. Those are going to stay where they are.
Yes, and for good reason.
Yes, those are okay. But yeah, I think that is a really interesting solution, and I like the graphs behind it. I like the thoughts, the imperceptible nature of it. I think we're just close enough to a time change that some of us might still be catching up. Our clocks are still catching up anyway, most of us.
My car's is, at least.
Yeah, I've lost power enough times that my microwave is probably fixed by now, but the car, and it will drive me crazy enough at one point, and I'll fix it, and then it'll take me a while the next time around. But,
right.
So that is, that's one of the interesting, I'm really glad we got to talk about that because I think we have an idea of what kind of legislation is looked at and what kind of problems you're solving in Columbus. And this to me is an unexpected one. And I think it's really neat to talk to what's going on. And it's not just the same things. Of course, you're doing important things that have to do with funding and budgets and things like that, but also things like this. Now, one of the expected things would be we just had an election. Mm-hmm. And there was an issue 1 on the ballot. So let's talk about what that was and the fallout now that the election is over.
Yep. So issue 1 obviously failed at the ballot, but it wasn't like it lost 2-1. It was pretty close. I think it was 53 or 54% in the no column and the balance in the yes column. And, I know that the proponents of issue 1 would point to, look, we didn't like the ballot language. We thought that definitely worked against us. And at the same time, I see some of the folks in the no column saying, well, this was, we expected this, there's lots of problems with it, be that as it may. I don't think that this election in particular is dispositive of this issue. I think that this continues to be a problem, and I would hope the legislature does try to address some of these things. But briefly, for those that may have read the ballot language and thought, oh my God, what is this? It helps to kind of get an idea of what the current redistricting process looks like.
There's some history going into this issue.
Correct, and I think some of the big concerns were, like before redistricting, you had to have equal size districts. You tried to keep counties whole to the extent you could. Same thing for local government subdivisions like your cities, townships, and villages. There was an aspirational goal that, hey, it probably should try to have some sort of statewide proportional representation. And what I mean by that is that, if you look at the last 4 or 5 elections, 10 years worth of statewide elections, Republicans have won, at least as of this time, 54 to 46% Republican, so a +8 Republican state. reformers on the side of issue one say, well, yeah, but to have a Senate that is basically 79% Republican, that's too far out of whack from where the proportional representation is. So issue one sought to have proportional representation be a more overarching mandate with this. And the opponents would say, well, what's going to happen is you're going to have this pinwheel effect as cities are carved out kind of like a pie to make sure that districts are as competitive as possible and drawn in such a way that the split tries to reach that proportional representation. And there's, frankly, problems with both sides at this point. But again, I do think reform will continue to be an issue. And I do have two pieces of legislation, one introduced already, one that's not, that I think will help some of our electoral problems. I do know that the administration, I think I can say this, I recall him mentioning that he was in support of the Iowa plan, but I'm not going to get into that because I think the administration and leadership wants to flesh out what that is. Okay. So we can talk about those proposals if you'd like.
I think, and especially, I think it's something we should talk about. Like you said, it was very close.
Yeah.
And the idea that this not being a decided issue is, well, definitely not, because even though it definitely didn't pass, there's definitely a lot of people that feel strongly that it should have, and it's enough that it's almost half and half. I mean, not half and half enough for the issue, right? But and I think some people were unhappy with redistricting as it was happening.
Sure.
And to be honest, there were court decisions about some of that.
Sure.
So it wasn't just people that were unhappy with it. So it seemed like something that definitely needed to be addressed. And if this wasn't the issue that was going to address it, then yeah, we need to look at, so what else is on the table? Let's look at what are the other proposals for that. So yeah, if you don't mind, that would be good to go into.
So it's not all redistricting, I should say.
Yeah.
The one that I have introduced is SJR 5, which deals with more of the, how shall we say, group of ballot initiatives that have passed over the years, whether it's abortion, whether it's marijuana, whether it's the defeat of that constitutional amendment to say the threshold to amend the Constitution goes up to 60%. Yeah. And frankly, there could have been on this cycle a minimum wage constitutional amendment. They ultimately didn't get enough signatures, and they said they were going to punt until 25 or 26. I don't know how that plays out. But clearly, there is a reform effort afoot that says, look, General Assembly, there are things that we think need to be done that you're not doing. Hence, again, when the abortion constitutional amendment passed, that was 57-43, I think, is what the final result was for that. Marijuana, same deal. I have, no qualms in saying that if minimum wage was on the ballot, that probably would have been a similar result as well. So the question is, how do you cut a nice compromise between the reformers who view it as, look, we don't think the General Assembly is acting as it should, but if we went the initiated statute route, which for the viewers is you don't have to go through the Constitution, you can actually put a law straight into the Ohio Revised Code at the ballot. That's the initiated statute part of it. But the reformers look at it this way, like, this is a very cumbersome process that at the end of the day, the General Assembly can say, all right, it passed, and we're just going to cancel the results for this, or amend them in such a way that it effectively canceled the results. And marijuana was used as an issue like that, because right out of the gate there was, okay, let's amend this, let's amend that. Ultimately, there was a bill that passed out of the Senate that was bipartisan. Only 2 members voted against it. The vast majority of Democrats did vote for it, so that was good. But what this does, SJR 5, I'm calling it the off-ramp. And what this does is it provides protection for reformers such that if this route is better for them, they can choose this route as opposed to the constitutional amendment route, because there are protections in place and because there's a realization that, and even amongst reformers, I don't think they would want to do the constitutional amendment process if they knew there was an easier, more protected, path that allowed for, if there were unforeseen problems, they could be amended, which is part of the problem of going through the Constitution. Because once it's there, you can't change it unless you go through the ballot. So what the proposal does is this, it's very simple. It says that currently to get, you have to go through all these hoops to get an initiated statute proposal on the ballot. 6% of the signatures of the last gubernatorial election are what you need ultimately to get it on the ballot. This actually cuts the signature threshold in half and does away with a lot of the process that allows the General Assembly a certain amount of time to amend this or adopt this, which I argue by definition, if they haven't done it already, they're probably not going to do it in that 4-month period of time anyway. But half the signature threshold, they get it on the ballot, and if it passes, there's what I call this cooling off period, where for 2 years, the General Assembly now needs a 60% supermajority to amend the section that was just passed at the ballot. The idea being that there's that protection in place for anything that passes at the ballot, and that lower signature threshold is sort of an enticement to go that path instead. But there are two things I would point out. One, this does not change in any way the constitutional amendment process, and and that's important to sort of highlight, because I think electoral issues are, people immediately get their hackles up and they're like, what's the story behind this?
What are we taking away? If we're putting this forward, what are we taking away? So, okay. So you're saying we're not taking away. This is just another route. I like also, it sounds like one of the things I hear a lot when I see something on the ballot for a constitutional amendment is, I see that this is an important issue we need to fix, but I don't know that it should be a constitutional amendment. I feel like you said, the concerns about being able to adjust it or amendment or things like that. And then on the other side, I hear, okay, but if it's not an constitutional amendment, if it passes, they have too many ways to change this to lose its effectiveness that we voted for in the first place.
Correct.
So it looks like you're coming with a bridge to, all right, let's come up with a way to not always have to use a constitutional amendment and still have you feel like it's not going to get scuttled as soon as it passes.
That's exactly right. But the nice part about this is, and I should say 60% is, my, throwing my hat into the ring here and just saying, look, this is a starting place.
Yeah.
But the idea that I had with this was that during that 2 years, it's okay. Give this reform a chance to become popular, give it a chance to work, see how that operates. But if there are things that are completely unworkable with this, odds are you're going to have both parties saying that. And if they do, and let's say you get the majority of the Democratic caucus as well as the Republican caucus to make changes, they're going to have way over that 60% threshold. But that's great. That's what it was meant to do. It's fostering more bipartisanship here, because the major tenets of the law would presumably remain in place, but the changes that we are elected to make are being done in a bipartisan fashion. So the hope anyway is that this is a better tool for reformers. If they don't want to take this path, great, don't. Go the constitutional amendment route, and that's still an option.
So it doesn't remove that route.
Correct.
It just makes it easier for the other route, but not just easier, a way that you feel like maybe the integrity of what you had on the ballot will still maintain its shape a little bit longer.
That's exactly right. The other reform in this space gets to the heart of proportional representation, and you're going to have to bear with me here. And this will also be a Senate joint resolution, but I don't have a number yet. I asked my legislative aide to drop it today.
Okay.
And this is going to seem strange because I'm calling for smaller districts, and which, of course, a consequence of that means more senators and more representatives. So Ohio currently has 33 senators and 99 state representatives. This resolution, if it were passed, we would then have 51 senators and 153 representatives. And you might think, how in the world does that actually solve or make better the proportional representation problem? So again, as I outlined before, 54-46 is typically how statewide elections turn out. State Senate's 79% Republican. As of this writing, it's going to go down once everybody's sworn in for the new GA. The House of Representatives is, high 60s, mid to high 60s in terms of percentages. So that's out of balance. If you think about this mathematically, think of a statewide district like the governor. So the governor is an elected Republican. You could have an elected Democrat as the governor. But right now, it is the most out of proportional representation district that we have in Ohio because of the 46% of Democrats, presumably, that did not vote for DeWine, in theory. What that means is they have no elected representation, and that's key, elected representation in the governor's office. So that's as far away from, because it's 100% Republican elected, that it's as far away from proportional representation as you can get. Now, and this is where I like to use a concept from calculus, the limit. Let's say that a district, everybody was their own representative.
Okay.
That's known as a direct democracy. But by definition, if everybody's voting for their own, party, if you will, excluding third parties.
And just to simplify, we'll just assume everyone's voting straight party, just so that we can do math here.
Right.
Yeah.
So Republican and Democrat, it is going to match the statewide proportion by definition, because
that is the statewide proportion. And that's where we got the statewide proportion statistic.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So it's a perfect match. The problem is there are also major problems with direct democracy. So what we can see from the mathematics of this is that as you approach closer to a direct democracy, you're going to approach a healthier statewide proportion. So by doing this, I would envision the state Senate would, obviously there's going to be more Republicans, there's going to be more Democrats, but I don't think that they would ultimately be able to have a mix of Republicans and Democrats that is in the 70% range now. It would probably be in the 60s at this point, given current trends. But that's the direction that you need to go anyway.
Get closer to the representation, because you can, like you said, you can see the statistics of we look at the whole state of Ohio, not district by district or section by section, but the whole state of Ohio. You know what that percent is. So the idea is, let's use math to get as close to that percentage as possible without going all the way to each individual direct democracy because of other difficulties that entails. But how can we get as close to that as possible? Yeah, okay.
And keep, some integrity with what we're doing. But, I would point out that even just the observation of where the Ohio Senate is now in the, mid to high 70s and where the House is right now, mid to high 60s, but given that the state House districts are 1/3 the size of the state Senate district, you can see that historically it has always been the case that the House has been much closer to.
That's a good point. We already have a control looking at the House versus the Senate
or at least
districts.
in recent memory, I think that works, because I do recognize that half the state Senate districts are up every 2 years. The other half is up the other cycles, but looking at this, I think there are other ancillary benefits to this. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we are the 7th most populous state in the United States. Our Senate districts are the 4th largest in terms of population. And if you look at the averages throughout the country, the average district for a Senate seat is about 160,000. For context, Ohio is 360,000. House seats are whatever 1/3 of that 160,000. I mean, they're like, I want to say 60 to 70,000 throughout the country, but our state House seats are about 120,000. This reform would take it to, I think I had the math down at 238,000 for the Senate seats and 77,000 for the House seats. But there's other ancillary benefits, as I mentioned. One, is that if you look at the makeup of the General Assembly now, you see a lot of, businessmen, nothing wrong with businessmen, but there's a lot of folks that own their own business, that are typically wealthier, and I feel like larger districts are much more expensive. You see statewide campaigns in Ohio, absolutely the most expensive. I think the Brown-Moreno race broke all sorts of records for the state in terms of spending, but you start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the amount of spending gets lower and lower and lower and lower. So I think this would actually make for cheaper campaigns, which is good, and legislators are more firmly anchored to their district. The smaller your district gets, the more you have to know your community. You're not going to have a state senate district like some of my colleagues that have 11 counties. It's really hard to get to know all the people in a given county if you represent 11 counties, and it takes you 3 or 4 hours to drive from one end of the district to another. And then finally, you're going to see, I think, if this reform were to pass, you'd be more likely to see a legislature that more firmly reflects the electorate. So right now, there's not, the number of lawyers is dwindling. There's not a lot of engineers, not a lot of teachers, not a lot of, tradesmen and women. And I think that's because of this, when you have these enormous districts that require tons of money, it's going to lend itself to people who are wealthier, well-connected, can fundraise really well. Smaller districts, however, are a little more organic in the sense that you can have people that, hey, I'm a teacher. I've taught at Coleraine High School for, 30 years. I've met all these students over the years, and if my district is literally nothing more than, at this point, Northwest Local School District might actually be the size of a State House district. With that, they don't need name ID in the sense that, or money as much, because everybody has some inkling of who that person is, and it helps them get elected and bring their perspective to Columbus, which I think is a great ancillary benefit.
Because we talk about the idea that people at certain levels of government are professional politicians, which is tough because the amount of input, the amount of effort they have to put into getting it to the state level requires it, especially in these bigger districts like you're talking about. But it also means that they don't necessarily know the community, but they're also not doing everyday work schedules and juggling jobs with it, which means they're less connected to the kind of things that when you are working a regular job, how what goes on in Columbus affects things like your paycheck and your daily life. And it might be really easy to get disconnected if the people we send aren't that connected.
Yeah, and I think this is, just healthier overall. Because again, you're more likely to get, sincere reformers elected to office with a change like this. And there is precedent to this. I would point out this is not a new idea. This is actually former Representative Gene Krebs. I think he represented Butler County and maybe a little north of there, maybe Preble. But in his book, he wrote about this exact same issue, that we should have smaller districts. And he used, I think, the example of Indiana having much, much cheaper elections because their districts are significantly smaller. I think at the federal level, I might butcher the name, but I think it's called Our Common Purpose is the organization. But they are seeking to increase the size of the U.S. House of Representatives, which obviously we can't do anything about. But you don't need a constitutional amendment at the federal level for that. They can do that in statute, and it has been fixed where it is since the 1920s. But they argue the exact same reasons that I just put forward. So it's not as if this doesn't have some sort of popular bipartisan backing. Moreover, the polling for this is such that, again, I'm sure people would, look at me and say, okay, he's a Republican. With everything around electoral issues, there's a lot of suspicion about what the other party is doing in this space. But the polling has shown that Democrats and Gen Z in particular are actually, we agree with this reform. It makes sense. We'd like to go for it. So these are some of the things.
Seems like if your neighborhood is more reflective of whichever party, you're going to see more of that representation, that would actually benefit you either way.
Yes.
I think the only people that wouldn't like it is if they were in the party that wasn't necessarily reflected in that tiny area. Then you would say, never mind.
Well, I can see incumbents saying, if it's easier for incumbents to raise money and, a district that's 360,000 people, or in the case of Congress where you're almost 1 million, you basically need TV. You need all these other things to win these races. Conversely,
Because you can't be in everyone's neighborhood.
well, that's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
exactly right. But at the same time, sincere reformers can, that don't have, large pockets,
Yeah.
can't hope to go and hit every single door in that district
Yeah.
and meet voters in a certain way. So this actually helps those folks. But again, I think doing reforms like this, doing reforms like SJR 5, whether we do, the Iowa plan that DeWine has pitched, these sorts of things, hopefully, in my mind, will, foster a sense of bipartisanship. We recognize this is the problem. Let's solve it this way. I don't know what the future holds in that, but I hope people take away that, hey, these are sincere reforms that aren't,
Yeah.
coming from out in the wilderness, that I think do make this a lot better.
Yeah, I think that it's also neat to know that they come out of things that, like you said, there's precedent for other people doing research on the same kind of ideas. It's not just something that just came out of the blue, out of nowhere. And I, of course, here at Waycross, local government, and I always talk about all government is local, which apparently in the 1830s comes from an AP guy, but it was repeated by Tip O'Neill because I looked it up. I feel really, government is local. The government that affects our daily life is the government that happens at our local level.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
right.
hard to feel connected. I think the reason we have this program is sometimes we don't feel connected to what's happening in Columbus.
Yeah.
But I think it's because sometimes we feel like it's not our local government. And this helps connect it a little bit more. It's supposed to be, back in the day, all of our state communities going to Columbus to figure out how to make things that are beneficial to the whole state, not just your area.
Sure.
And maybe breaking it into smaller pieces makes it feel more like that again. Do you think that the number of voters in each district now being so big is because it's based on numbers from so long ago? Just the populations have just changed?
Well, yeah, the population grows, but the number is fixed, and it's
Yeah.
in the Constitution. I did not look up when the last time that was changed. My guess is it's been that way for a very, very long time. So I just see this problem getting worse, the same way that it's kind of getting worse for Congress, where, you look at who's in Congress and it's, I don't think, again, a sincere reformer can really win districts with 1 million people. It's going to be somebody who's, I think, well-connected. So
Yeah, and that cost of elections, the cost of running an election, when you see someone who is qualified and sincere and they want to make an impact, either party, it's hard to, that's not enough.
Yes.
It's not enough when you have someone that you're running against that just has really deep pockets.
and has been there
Yeah.
for a long time,
Yeah.
might have, significant name ID,
Yeah.
all these things. And so I don't know. We will see. But see, this is one of the reasons why, pitching these proposals is that I do think, I'm thinking of my colleagues, to sit there and say, well, issue 1 was defeated in November. We don't have to worry about any reform. That was that. Voters have spoken, which they did. Does not, I don't think
Yeah.
it's dispositive of the issue. And doing things like this in a bipartisan fashion, I think ensures that, for the opponents of issue 1, they don't find themselves in a position where people, 4, 5, 6 years down the road say, look, we've seen everything that's happened. We're just ignoring everything. We're going to vote this way. And sorry, you had your chance and you didn't take it.
Well, and like you said, the voters have spoken, but what they have said is that at least half of us think this is a really important issue. And even
Absolutely.
the ones who voted against it, it doesn't mean they don't think it's an important issue. It just means they didn't like that iteration of it. So
I think that's a fair assessment for sure.
it's definitely something that everybody, there's a big enough pool to make that still something to consider. I don't think it's enough to just go, survive that one, move on, yeah.
That's exactly right. Oh, one final thing with that,
Yes.
though. I also got to point this out. issue one obviously was supercharged. Increasing the number of legislators and having these smaller districts is something that can be overlaid to any redistricting process. So had issue one passed, you know, if we do the Iowa plan in the future, if we just stick with the status quo, it doesn't affect any of those. If anything, issue one, had it passed in its mandate for proportional representation, probably would have acted in a complementary fashion to that, albeit indirectly, but it does nothing with respect to the actual redistricting process.
So this isn't an or, this isn't a, I'm putting this forward in place of, or to prevent us from considering this question later.
Exactly.
It's an and.
Correct.
Okay, I like that. We're gonna Venn diagram later today. No, we're not. We're not really gonna do that, but I
Unions, intersections, yes.
wish we were now. Now you know how nerdy I am. We have covered a lot of stuff. I'm gonna pause for 1 second. If someone is watching and they're saying, I have opinions about these things, or I have questions about these things, who should they contact?
They should contact my office, and I would definitely use email for that. That is SD, short for Senate District, 08 at OhioSenate, all one word, .gov.
Okay. I want to pause here because we have gone into a lot of detail on these two topics that we have talked about so far. I think we have more to talk about, so I think we are going to continue with another program. If you're watching, keep your eyes open. There's going to be a follow-up program with even more details of things that are going on in Columbus. I want to thank you for joining us. If you want more information, or if you just want to reach out to Senator Blessing about any of these topics and say, hey, I have some thoughts about that, or I have some questions about that, remember you can reach out at that email that he gave us, and he definitely wants to hear from you. That's what we are hearing over and over again. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.